Hello everyone, welcome to the LangFocus channel, and my name is Paul. Today we're going to look at the differences between two languages that many people mistakenly think are the same, Russian and Ukrainian. The misconception that Russian and Ukrainian are the same might stem from the fact that Russian is widely spoken in Ukraine. The numbers differ depending on the survey, but according to one 2015 survey, 60% of Ukrainians consider Ukrainian their native language. 15% consider Russian to be their native language, and 22% consider both to be their native languages. These numbers do not include Crimea, which has been annexed by Russia, or parts of the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, which are not currently under Ukrainian control. Those areas have a Russian-speaking majority. It's also worth noting that most Ukrainian speakers can also speak Russian, even if it's as a second language. Some people may hear Ukrainians speaking Russian and think to themselves, wow, Ukrainian is so similar to Russian. But what they should say to themselves is, wow, Russian is so similar to Russian. On top of that, some people use a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian called Surzhyk, and they may not be consciously aware of which elements are Ukrainian and which are Russian. This code mixing may also blur the lines between Ukrainian and Russian. However, despite the sometimes unclear delineation between the two languages, Standard Russian and Standard Ukrainian are clearly distinct, and the vernacular speech of most people is also clearly distinct. Both languages developed from the Old East Slavic language, which comprised a set of mutually intelligible dialects spoken within the Federation of Rus, which later came to be referred to as Kievan Rus. These Old East Slavic speakers are thought of as the ancestors of today's Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. When Kievan Rus fell, the Slavic tribes were divided into two separate states, and the Old East Slavic dialects in those separate states began to grow apart from each other and undergo different influences. Tribes to the east came under the rule of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and their dialects evolved into Russian. Standard Russian, which is dominant today, developed with more influence from Old Church Slavonic, the Old Slavic literary language, which differed from vernacular dialects. Also, under Peter the Great, who aimed to turn Russia into a major Western power, Russian adopted a significant amount of vocabulary from French and other European languages. Tribes to the west came under the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Standard Ukrainian was based on spoken vernacular, specifically the southeastern dialects, and lacks much of the Old Church Slavonic influence that Russian has. Ukrainian also underwent a lot of Polish influence due to geographic proximity and Polish political control, with Polish being a lingua franca for a period of time. This is especially true in Western Ukrainian dialects. Now let's cut to the chase and start looking at the languages themselves. Vocabulary. Russian and Ukrainian share about 62% lexical similarity. I personally found this number surprisingly low. Ukrainian has a higher lexical similarity with Polish, Slovak, and Belarusian than it does with Russian, especially with Belarusian. Even among very basic words, there are lots of differences. The word for paper, in Ukrainian,
Папір.
and in Russian.
Бумага.
I suspect the Ukrainian word was borrowed from Polish, which in turn borrowed it from German. The word for sugar.
Цукор.
Сахар.
Both of these words are cognates that trace back to Proto-Indo-European. The Russian word traces back to Old East Slavic, while the Ukrainian word was borrowed from Polish, which borrowed it from German. The word for money.
Гроші.
Деньги.
This Russian word is a borrowing from a Turkic language, but Russian also has a cognate of the Ukrainian word,
Гроши.
which refers to pennies or a small amount of money, and is also the name of some older types of coins. The word for morning.
Ранок.
Утро.
The word for bottle.
Пляшка.
This word traces back to Polish and then to German.
Бутылка.
This Russian word is also a loanword from Polish, which in turn got it from French. In Polish, butelka is a more general word, while flaszka is more for hard liquor. Also, the names of months are different. In Russian, the names of months came from Latin via Old Church Slavonic. In Ukrainian, the names of the months are original vernacular Slavic words. For example, January, in Russian,
Январь.
and in Ukrainian,
Січень.
and February,
Февраль.
Лютий.
and so on. As with most languages which are closely related, there are lots of false friends in Russian and Ukrainian, words that appear to have the same meaning but actually don't.
Час.
This Ukrainian word means time.
Час.
This Russian word means hour.
Гарбуз.
This means pumpkin.
Арбуз.
and this means watermelon.
Неділя.
This means Sunday,
Неделя.
and this means week.
Сварити.
This means to scold in the imperfective form,
Сварить.
and this means to boil in the perfective form.
Світ.
This word means world.
Свет.
This means light. This Russian word does have a secondary meaning of world, but only in some fixed expressions.
Лаяти.
This means to scold.
Лаять.
This word means to bark. Orthography and pronunciation. Both languages use varieties of the Cyrillic alphabet, but there are a number of differences between the Russian variety and the Ukrainian variety. First, Ukrainian has this letter, which represents the sound g, but Russian doesn't have this letter. In Russian, g is represented by this letter. In Ukrainian, this letter is normally pronounced as.
Га.
Next, Ukrainian has this letter, which represents the sound e, but Russian doesn't have this letter. In Russian, this letter represents the sound e. Ukrainian has this letter, which represents the sound ye. In Russian, this letter represents the similar sound ye. But in Ukrainian, this letter represents the sound e. And in Russian, that sound e is represented by this letter, a letter which isn't used in Ukrainian. Russian has this letter, which represents the sound I, a letter which Ukrainian doesn't have. Instead, in Ukrainian, this letter represents the equivalent sound, in addition to the sound I. For example, the words meaning soap, in Russian,
Мыло.
and in Ukrainian.
Мило.
Ukrainian has this letter to represent the sound yi, but Russian doesn't have this letter. In Russian, this sound is represented by a combination of two letters. Russian has this letter to represent the sound yo, but Ukrainian doesn't use this letter. Instead, it uses a combination of two letters. Russian has this special letter that doesn't represent a sound, but indicates that the previous consonant is in its hard consonant form, in a context where you would expect the soft consonant form. Ukrainian doesn't use this letter, but instead uses an apostrophe after the consonant. So in Russian, it's written like this,
Объект.
while in Ukrainian, it's written like this.
Об'єкт.
Grammar. The concepts of grammar in Russian and Ukrainian are generally the same. They both have three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. They both have almost the same set of noun cases that apply to adjectives and pronouns as well. They share the same major verb conjugations, and so on. But the exact word forms are often different, or at least not entirely the same. Let's look at the different case forms for the noun meaning head in both languages. These words are cognates. In Russian,
Голова.
and in Ukrainian.
Голова.
These are both in the nominative singular form. Notice that in the nominative singular, they are spelled exactly the same, but sound fairly different. The first consonant is one that I mentioned before, which normally sounds like g in Russian, but
Га.
in Ukrainian. In Russian, the O vowel is frequently reduced to a or schwa when unstressed, while in Ukrainian it tends to not be reduced. Now, looking at the case forms, one thing to notice is that the case endings have some different vowels. Some are different letters representing equivalent sounds. For example, the Russian genitive singular,
Головы.
and the Ukrainian genitive singular.
Голови.
Others represent different sounds. For example, the Russian dative singular
Голове.
and the Ukrainian dative singular.
Голові.
Another thing to notice is that while Ukrainian has a vocative case, Russian does not. The vocative form is the form you use when you are addressing or calling someone or something. The old vocative form was lost from Russian, except for a few specific words, for example, when addressing God.
Боже.
It seems that it's being used less and less in spoken Ukrainian as well, but is still used by some and is part of standard Ukrainian. In Russian, a new vocative form is apparently starting to develop, in which the final vowel is dropped, usually from names and familial words. For example,
Мама.
becomes,
Мам.
but whether or not it's a genuine vocative case form is debated. Another common difference is that in Russian, the copula,
Быть.
the word meaning to be, is not used in the present tense. This is often true in Ukrainian too, which has a lot of dialectal variation, but in formal standard speech, and in Western dialects closer to Poland, the copula is commonly used. For example, let's look at the sentences meaning, this is illegal. In Russian,
Это незаконно.
in Ukrainian, it could be similar,
Це незаконно.
or it might have the copula like this.
Це є незаконно.
In Western Ukraine, it might be like this.
То є незаконно.
To je is similar to to jest in Polish. Another difference is that Ukrainian has some additional verb conjugations that Russian doesn't have. In Ukrainian, there's an additional way to express the imperfective future that Russian doesn't have. Take the sentence meaning, they will be eating, or they will eat, in an imperfective sense. In Russian,
Они будут есть.
and now in Ukrainian, first with an equivalent structure.
Вони будуть їсти.
In both languages, there's the subject pronoun, the third person plural, then the future conjugation of the verb meaning to be, followed by the infinitive of the lexical verb, the main verb that supplies the core meaning. But Ukrainian also has this form.
Вони їстимуть.
Rather than using the verb to be, a suffix is attached to the infinitive, followed by the same future inflection that appeared on the verb meaning to be. This alternate conjugation is called the imperfective synthetic future tense. Ukrainian also has a pluperfect conjugation that Russian doesn't have, though not everyone uses it in Ukrainian anymore. For example, here's a sentence meaning, I had been reading this book, but I forgot its contents.
Я читав був цю книжку та забув її зміст.
The pluperfect is formed with the past tense perfective form of the lexical verb, followed by the past tense of the verb meaning to be. In Russian, the sentence would be,
Я читал эту книгу, но забыл ее содержание.
in Russian, the past tense perfective form of the verb is used, rather than a special pluperfect form. This might be a good time to stop for a moment and examine some other differences between these two sentences. Before we saw that the words for this are different. That was in the neuter nominative form. Here they are, both in the feminine accusative form. And again, they take on slightly different forms. Next, notice the words meaning book are cognate but with different forms. The Ukrainian word is in its diminutive form,
Книжку.
which is the everyday way to say book. It can also be said with the same form as in Russian, but that would be more formal in Ukrainian. In Russian, there is also a diminutive form.
Книжка.
It's less common than in Ukrainian, and an even more informal word for book or something like a booklet. Both words are in the accusative singular form here. Notice that the words for but are different. However, it's worth noting that the primary meaning of the Ukrainian word is and. This word
Але.
is a more common word for but. And notice the cognate words meaning forgot that take somewhat different forms. Next, these are the third-person feminine singular genitive personal pronouns, and these words are cognates. And finally, we see the nouns meaning content. The Russian word
Содержание.
consists of the verb
Содержать.
meaning to contain, plus
Ание.
a suffix that forms abstract nouns from verbs. The Ukrainian word is a simple noun that isn't composed of these two parts. Another difference is that Russian, at least formal Russian, makes use of active participles to give extra information about a noun or a noun phrase, while Ukrainian does not. For example, the phrases meaning the woman sitting on the chair. First in Russian,
Женщина, сидящая на стуле.
this phrase has an active participle, but in Ukrainian, this meaning would be expressed using a relative clause.
Жінка, що сидить на стільці.
This is like saying the woman that sits on the chair. That's also how this meaning would be expressed in daily speech in Russian.
Женщина, которая сидит на стуле.
In the Russian sentence, the relative pronoun is,
Которая.
but in Ukrainian, there are several possibilities,
Котрий.
which is cognate with the Russian word,
Який.
or,
Що.
as in the sentence above. And as a side note, look at the different forms the word for woman takes. In Russian, it's,
Женщина.
while in Ukrainian, it's.
Жінка.
The preposition meaning on is the same, except for slightly different vowel quality, and the words for chair are clearly related but take on different forms. In the most basic form, the nominative singular, the Russian word is,
Стул.
and the Ukrainian word is.
Стілець.
Here they are in the locative case, though for Russian it's often referred to as the prepositional case. Now let's look at one final sentence and see what we find. These sentences mean, I can't go because I'll be working tomorrow. In Russian,
Я не могу пойти, потому что завтра я буду работать.
and in Ukrainian.
Я не можу піти, тому що завтра я буду працювати.
Word for word, both sentences are, I, negative, can go because tomorrow I will be to work. Notice that the first two words, meaning I, then the negative, are basically the same. Next, the words meaning can are cognates but have grown apart and are now pronounced differently, notably the second consonant. Next, the verbs meaning go are cognates. They are both perfective infinitive forms. Both verbs contain a perfective prefix attached to the imperfective verb. Next, there's a compound conjunction meaning because in both languages, and these parts are cognates, but the Russian compound contains an extra element. In Ukrainian, a different conjunction
Бо.
can also be used. Next, the words for tomorrow are basically the same. After that, we see the subject pronoun again, but it isn't necessary and can be dropped because the subject is clear from the conjugation of the verb. Both Russian and Ukrainian are pro-drop languages. Next, the imperfective future tense is formed in the same way, with the verb meaning to be as the auxiliary verb in the future tense, followed by the infinitive of the lexical verb meaning to work. But the lexical verbs themselves are different. The Ukrainian word was borrowed from Polish. Now remember that Ukrainian has the alternate way of saying something in the imperfective future. So this could also be
Я працюватиму.
As I'm sure you can see, Russian and Ukrainian are very closely related languages that share a lot of similarities, but they also have a lot of differences, some of them minor and some of them major. Lots of different vocabulary, different pronunciation, and different word forms that have arisen over time make the two languages only partially mutually intelligible to people who don't have much exposure to the other language. But since most Ukrainian speakers also speak Russian or have extensive exposure to it, asymmetric intelligibility is the norm. In other words, Ukrainian speakers can often understand Russian, while the Russian speaker doesn't understand Ukrainian, especially Russian speakers from outside Ukraine. The question of the day. For speakers of Russian and Ukrainian, how similar do you think the two languages are? To what extent can you understand the other one? And for other people, how similar do Russian and Ukrainian seem to you? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out LangFocus on the various social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And as always, I want to give a very special thanks to my Patreon supporters, especially my top-tier Patreon supporters, whose names are right here on the screen. Many special thanks to them. And to everyone, thank you for watching and have a nice day.